Okay.
This has not been going well this morning. My lips aren't working, man. haSukot. Woo! That one's for all times. That didn't work very well. All right. Let's get going, kids. That's not supposed to be on. The big monitor, it really messes with my head. Y'all say hi to my daughter, and her gigantic head gets in there. Just do it. Oh no, she broke it. Wow, we're having fun down here in Texas. Everybody else, every one of our big tent just leaking. I mean, the rain comes down, it goes right through it, like it's a net instead of I don't know. We're having a great time though. Daryl Lee got here last night, and we stuck his tent right under the what's that called? The spout, the gutter. Stuck his tent right under. It was dark. We couldn't see anything. Wow. It starts pouring out rain. The gutter's landing right on the top of his tent. But he did find out his house is, in fact, waterproof. Yeah, we're having a time. But, you know, this is the way God wanted us to do it. He wanted us to learn all about Sukot through an actual real-life experience. And we are really experiencing it. All right, so let's get started. There is a vast difference between the Western, you know, that's like America and Europe, as opposed to the East or the Middle East. There is a vast difference between the Western literal mindset, historical idiomatic mindset. To tell you the truth, most Yehudim, that's the fancy word for Jews, had trouble understanding the idiomatic teaching of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Rabbim. That's the law, the prophets, and the rabbis of the biblical period. Yeah, they did. As the age of Hellenism overtook the Judean world, the ability to understand these idiomatic teachings became increasingly harder to understand. Even among those who taught the people, they lost their way. When everything becomes literal, in a world that's idiomatic, it's the end of days, people. It is the end of the world as we know it. It is over. And this was the end of the beginning. Or the beginning of the end. You decide. The more Hellenized the Yehudim became, the more they rejected the Torah, that's the law, in favor of a Brit Chadashah. Yeah, that's New Covenant, right? The more the Jews became Hellenized, the more they rejected God's law in favor of a holy new covenant. Everybody's like, no, Rob. That's what the Christians did. No. Hear me out. The more Hellenized the Yehudim became, the more they gave up the Torah and followed their Berit Chadashah, their new covenant, which they called the oral law or the oral tradition. Yeah, that was their new covenant. The oral tradition began as a way to help the Yehudim, the Jews, not to break commandments in the Torah, but it quickly became a way to release the Yehudim of their obligation to live according to the Torah, as you can well imagine. It makes no difference who did or did not write the Sefarim Shelichim, as I call it. Others call it the New Testament letters. But those letters attributed to the Christian religion makes no difference who did or did not write those letters, or even when those letters were written, because that sometimes is argued. What does matter is that the content of these letters reveal an immense split in the Perushim, which is also called Pharisaic, in that sect of Judaism, which began in the early 1st century CE and continued on until circa the 800 CE. So what I'm trying to tell you is there was a group that are now called the Pharisees. That's not what they were called in that time. They were called the Perushim, but that's become known as Pharisaic Judaism and the Pharisees and modern Judaism, if you will. That group was going through a split, an utter split. On the left, you had one rule of thought, and on the right, you had another. These letters reveal that in vivid detail. And by the way, so do the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Perushim, or the Pharisees, in charge of the Adat, that's what we now call synagogues, from the time of the Maccabean revolt, until the time of the mid-1st century CE. I always worry that people don't know what CE means, because that's only for the politically correct, right? That's only for academia. CE is the same thing as AD, for those of you who don't know that there's a politically correct way to say AD. I don't care. We're still talking about the reason why it happened is because it's before Christ and after his death, right? It's not really what they say. That's what it became. But it's BCE, which is before the Common Era, right? No, they say common, not current. And then AD. What? That's what I said. Stop talking to me. I'm hearing voices. Anyway, so the BCE is it's before Christ. We all know this. We all know that it was built around when they thought he was born. They missed it by about 6 years. I'm just saying, but they didn't have a lot of information to work from. It wasn't terribly bad, but it was messed up by about 6 years. But we know that it's before the time of Jesus, the Christian Jesus, and after the time of the Christian Jesus. We all know that's what it stands for, right? But we say in academia, we say in politically correct circles, BCE, before the Common Era, or we say CE, the Common Era, because we're still in it. This is the one, right? So we just say CE. So hopefully you understand that the Maccabeans were here before Jesus, right? And no, they did not win these gigantic battles and have these big wars and win back the temple. We now know, because of the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they negotiated back the temple. There were 2 small skirmishes in which they did win, and that in and of itself was a miracle. And so celebrating that miracle is okay with me. But you got to understand that that's not how they got it or why they got it. They got it because Antiochus the Fifth, I think, there was a lot of them, had his dad killed. It's pretty obvious that's what happened. And he negotiated to give this building that nobody on the planet wanted back to the Jews. Because they describe it as overgrown with bushes and plants weeds and nonsense everywhere. Nobody even wanted the place. And he didn't understand why we had to have a war, because that's where we were headed, was war over a building that nobody wanted but the Jews. Give it to them. That was his attitude. And he negotiated a deal. We now have that in places where you can actually fly to that place, go into that place and see that actual document. Of course, if you don't read certain languages. You won't be able to understand it, but they'll have a translation there for you. Anyway, so the Maccabees, from between that time and the time of Jesus, so that everybody will know what I'm talking about. That's why I'm saying it this way, because I want you to know the exact time span here. Now, let me back up and say this again. So the Pharisees that were in charge of the synagogues from the time of the Maccabean revolt until the time of Jesus, eventually those Jews, the ones that were in charge at that time, up until the time of Jesus, those Jews would eventually travel to a place called Yavne, and in due course become the modern Jews of today. Most of whom believe they are following the Torah, completely unaware that this group forsook the Torah over 2,000 years ago. The other group of Perushim, because remember, this is a split in the Pharisaic movement. The other group to which Yeshua and his Talmudim, that's the guy they call Jesus, and his disciples, the one that they belonged to, took control of the Adat, of the synagogues, in the latter half of the mid-1st century, as evidenced by these letters. You can read it in the one called Ma'asim, or Acts, A-C-T-S, the Acts, because it's about what they did. Because it says that when the brother of Yeshua, the guy they call Jesus, his brother's name was Yaakov, they call him James. When he gives a judgment in the Beit Din in Yerushalayim, it should tell you that the followers of Yeshua are now running the synagogues in Jerusalem. You should know that from these letters. It's right there in black and white. And it's not contested except by people who don't want to believe it. It's actually quite overwhelming that they took over. So the group that particular group became the largest Yehudit, or shall I say a more modern word, the largest Jewish sect. What's the word we use in America for sect? Denomination. Think of it that way if you need to. The largest denomination of the Jewish religion in the entire world. That group that followed Yeshua, they were the largest denomination, if you will, of Jewish believers in the entire world. Think about the numbers. The vast majority of the Jews at that time lived in Judea, and the vast majority of the Jews in that time believed in Yeshua as the Mashiach. They did. Very few disagreed with it. Very few. So they were the largest sect. They enjoyed great numbers and great wealth. However, this group began to tear apart very early on. Very early on. It's right there in the letters. They talk about what's tearing them apart. The Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 135 CE. Remember, that's the AD thing. That drove the death knell in the separation of these two groups. Bar Kokhba claimed to be the Mashiach, the Messiah, and even acquired the backing of a well-known rabbi by the name of Akiva, who prophesied that Bar Kokhba was in fact the Mashiach. What? But the majority of the Yehudim, the majority of the Jews of that time, believed that Yeshua was the Mashiach. They had no reason not to believe it. And they refused to follow Bar Kokhba into battle against the Romans. That was the end of it. That was the utter split between the left and the right in the Pharisaic movement. The Perushim, that group, the Pharisaic group to which Yeshua belonged, began to fragment and eventually allowed non-Judean-born members into leadership. As the scales tipped more non-Judean, paganism brought in by non-Judean-born Jewish philosophers began to tear this group apart at the seams. By the time Constantine won his war, this group was in utter turmoil. Constantine eventually sent each of these groups a letter in which he subtly threatened military force if the leaders of these mostly non-Judean congregations refused to separate themselves from Judaism altogether. Thus, the Catholic religion, under development by these pagan philosophers, began to form as a replacement a replacement for Pharisaic Judean Judaism. A large portion of the Catholic diocese split off and formed the group now known as the Christian Church in the 1500s CE, also known as AD. So if you take 15 from 20, what do you get?
Minus 5.
5. What are we in the 20th or 21st century? 21st century. So you got to take 15 from 21 is
6.
That was 600 years ago. The church, CHURCH, began 600 years ago. The Christian church did not exist in the time of Jesus. Catholicism truly began at the time of Constantine, but it didn't even have a name until the 400s. They did not have their first pope until the middle 400s. So Catholicism did not exist in the time of Jesus. It did not exist. There were no Christians at Antioch. There were no Christians persecuted anywhere in Judea during the time of Jesus and his disciples. Not one. Why? Because they did not exist. There is no connection, the one to the other, at that time period. Okay, so it happened in the 1500s, Christianity. Christianity and its many fragmented groups such as Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., have their origins in Catholicism. Catholicism, not Judaism. No one knows what became of the Jewish sect to which Yeshua and his Talmudim belonged. No one knows. They fell into obscurity and at best have existed only as a very small fragment to this day, if they exist at all. Given that Catholicism and Christianity developed completely independent of Judaism, it should be no surprise that their doctrine developed with little and often no knowledge of the biblical language, history, customs, and culture. In fact, from the beginning of Catholicism, their history predating Constantine is utterly made up. Christian history predating Constantine is made up as well because it was taken from Catholicism. Since the Western world did not understand the idiomatic, parabolic nature of the biblical text, the doctrine of the church took on a very literal interpretation of all things biblical. This literal approach is not only embraced, but encouraged by the church to this very day. I've said all of that to lay a foundation for a biblical, say, parabolic understanding of the Feast of Sukot. I got the wrong word written there. So the name of this message, I got the wrong word there, is Mashal haSukot. If you forgive me for misspelling some things. All right, so the church and some in Judaism read the story of Adam and Chava. That's Adam and Eve to the people in America. They read that story and they see this story as an explanation of how man came into existence, right? Because first day God creates this, and the next day he creates that, and eventually he creates a man, then he takes the man and pops a rib out of the man. That's why the man walks this way now, and builds a woman from it, right? And then there's a lot of incest, and then the world begins. I mean, if you really think about it, it's a horrible way to start a world, because it would never work. But anyway, that's what they see, because it's been passed down for generation to generation to generation. This is how the world began. And it's not. It's a story about why. Not a story about how. It's a story about why. But anywho, further, they see the expulsion of man from the Garden of Eden. That's Eden. It's a Hebrew word. It means pleasure, garden of pleasure, as the ultimate fall of man from the grace of God. With these beliefs as the church's foundational backdrop, It is no wonder that they began to place the idea of the return of a Messiah, that I'll use their word, as the ultimate forgiveness of any and all sin. That is to say, and I'm talking about church stuff here, so I'm going to use their words, Jesus not only paid the price for sins past, but he also for sins future. Jesus' death wipes away the need to live according to the Torah, since he did that in place of the Christians, thus freeing Christian converts to say an 8-second prayer as long as they believe what they say, and salvation is assured to even the most vile of humans. In the end, the cross represents the return of man to the garden of pleasure with God. No guilt, no condemnation, no responsibility, no culpability, no punishment, nothing required, but everything gained. Because if you stop and think about it, the whole philosophy is this. God gave the Jews a law that according to the Jews, no human being can possibly live by. Well, we got to have some excuse, right? I'm going to get some email for that. And then they didn't live by it, so God got sick to death of them and said, wipe my hands of it. You're going to start something new over here. And so he says, hey, Christians, you know the way I did it before? I really messed it up. I didn't know what I was doing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start a new thing with you guys, and even I can't tell you what to do. I mean, that's Christian philosophy in a nutshell. I know I'm being very facetious, if you will, but absurd. And I know that. I'm doing this on purpose because I want you to think about that. I want you to think about just how ridiculous this idea is. But we all bought it hook, line, and sinker for those of us who grew up in a different way than the one we're on now. Anyway, Yeshua and his Talmudim came from a very different worldview and thus taught a very different version of the cross, forgiveness of sin, and the restoration of God's children. Very different. Aharon, also known as Luke for some reason, in Luke chapter 2, he speaks of a man named Shimon. I think they call him Simon. And a woman named Hannah. What would that be, Anna? I don't remember I don't know the English word. Is it Anna? Yeah, okay, we think it's Anna. Who were waiting in the Hechal, that's the temple if you don't know, for the reconciliation. They were waiting for the reconciliation of the Christian church. They were waiting, no. They were waiting for the foundation of the Christian church. No, that text says they were waiting for the reconciliation of Yisrael, of Israel, in case you don't know what that meant, right? The reconciliation of Israel. And this is in the New Testament, people. But once Shimon held that child, he declared that he had seen the salvation of God. Could you even imagine what it would be like for a Jew to be able to stand in the temple of God and know that he had seen God's salvation? The Yehudim, the Jews, especially of this period, were not looking for a Mashiach to release them from the Torah. They didn't live by it. Anything you read from this time period will tell you that the Jews didn't live by it. Why do you think the Essenes moved out to the country? Just everything that they wrote was nobody follows God's law anymore. And if you think about it, why would you? The fire never comes down. I mean, they got the temple. They got the temple back. And the guy doubled the size of it. They built it, rebuilt it. That guy Herod, the not so great. He builds this thing back. Of course, the first thing he did was put idols in it, but that's another issue. You know, put the big eagle at the front door. Herod? But anywho, he builds this thing and he doubles the size of it, really makes it massive and makes it pretty and all that, because it was beautiful. And they're having their sacrifices, and still the fire's not coming down, which means they're not being forgiven for their sin. If God's not going to forgive you for the sin, no matter what you do, why on earth would you do what he says? What's the point? What's the use? If I'm just going to be guilty all the time, why don't I just go be guilty all the time? You see what I'm saying? This was the state of things in Judaism at the time of the Second Temple, in a nutshell. You can read it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can read it in the New Testament letters. You can read it in virtually anything written in the time period. Even the Maccabees wrote about it. All right, so they weren't looking for a Messiah who was going to release them from the Torah. They had already been released. They had no covenant. The Torah was their covenant, and God had ended that covenant with Hosea. Right? Most Jews should know that. They were not looking for a Mashiach who would wipe away all the bad things that they had done in their lives so that they could live a life free of a guilty conscience. These concepts didn't exist in that time period. But to understand the reconciliation of Yisrael, the taking away of the sin of the world, as one man called it, the salvation of God, the forgiveness of sin, all of these are the same thing. But for us to understand it, we need to take a slight detour and consider something from the New Testament. And the Jews are all saying, "What?" Bear with me. This is the one verse that I think every Jew on this planet needs to memorize. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. You got to memorize it. You have to memorize it. It says, because it was written by a Jewish rabbi, I'm just saying. And he was well trained. He knew what he was talking about. But he said, everyone who commits sin also rebels against the Torah, because sin is Torah, rebellion. Sin is Torah, it's the best explanation of what sin is and what it is not that you will find anywhere on this planet. It outdoes everything in the Babylonian Talmud. I've read the whole thing, I know. It's better than anything in the Jerusalem Talmud. It's better than anything in the Chumash. You name it. This is the best explanation you will ever find. And what's funny is when the Christians start saying, we live by grace and not by the law, blah, 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 you want to throw this one at them. Everyone, because it's in their book, right? Everyone who commits sin also rebels against the Torah, because sin is Torah. Sin is Torah rebellion. In short, if the Torah tells us to do something and we don't, we are living in sin. If the Torah tells us not to do something and we do it, we are living in sin. Additionally, if the Torah does not define something to be sin, it does not matter how offended we are by it. It is not sin. So, what was the sin of the world then? Because that's what they called it, right? The reconciliation of Yisrael was also called was needed, I should say, because of the sin of the world, right? Was it a fruit hanging from some tree? Did Yeshua's death wither that tree in the Garden of Eden? The tree of life. This is so important that we learn this lesson. The tree of life is the Torah. It always has been. It always will be. The Torah is the tree of life. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is something we call rebellion against the Torah. So, what was the sin committed in the garden? Hey, temple! No. The sin was mixing the holy with the unholy. In other words, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the mixing of Torah observance with Torah rebellion. It is that simple. In Bereshit, also known as Genesis, chapter 2, verse 26, God said, "Let us make mankind in our own image, after our likeness." And for the Trinitarians out there, see there's three gods. I'm sorry, that's not how it works in Hebrew. You say it in plural, not because there's a plurality, because a plurality begins at 2, not 3. Think about it. Just saying. So it can be 2, 3, 4, 5, a gazillion, a frazillion, a bajillion. I don't know which one of those non-words is higher. Anyway, they say it in plural because they're talking about a God that is living. It's just like the word for face, pane, panim. Those words are always in plural if the person is alive. Why? Because every second of every day that you are alive, your face is changing. It changes just simply from the breathing in and the breathing out. It changes from happiness to sadness to rage to gladness to whatever, right? All of these emotions change. It changes when you wake up in the morning, you're opening your eyes because they've been closed for the last 8 hours, right? There's always change. And so it's said in the plural to indicate life. Not plurality, life. So let the living God make mankind in the living God's image, after the living God's likeness, would be a much more accurate translation. But it didn't say man. Let us make man. This is where it went wrong. This is where it went south. Because the word is mankind. Let us make mankind. In verse 8, God placed mankind in the garden. Are you getting that there's more than one? You should be. It's mankind, not a man. In verse 9, God placed the Torah, remember that, the tree of life, and choice, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the tree of choice. He places that in the garden in verse 9. In verse 16 and 17, God commands mankind to be Torah observant. How did he do that? He said, of every tree you may eat freely. But in the day that mankind rebels against the Torah, in the day that he eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he will be separated from the presence of God. The way they say it, literally, he will surely die. Or die, he will die is really how it would be literally said. Die, he will die. It doesn't mean that he dies a physical death. It means that he dies a spiritual death. He is out of the presence of God the moment he mixes the clean and the unclean. In verse 18, God says, it is not appropriate for mankind to experience loneliness. Now, we know there's more than one, but how can you have a whole bunch of people out there and they're experiencing loneliness? But God went on and said, I will create someone like him. Now, she was someone he could talk to, someone he could count on, someone he could love wholeheartedly. In verse 19, God created all the animals and he brought them to mankind. That was very similar to what happened in heaven when God created the host of heaven. In verse 20, we find out that there was no ezer kenegdo for the man, just as there had been no ezer kenegdo for God. I told you this is a story about why, not how. Let me say that again. In verse 20, we find out that there was no ezer kenegdo for the man, just as there had been no ezer kenegdo for God. Are you seeing the connection? We know the story of God in heaven and all of the host of heaven, and here we're being told this story about mankind. We're supposed to see the connection. What is the ezer kenegdo? Is that the doormat God needed someone he could just stomp on? You know, because it's like that in the world today, right? Oh, a woman, she's submitting to the man and she's his doormat and she has to, you know, when the man slaps her around, she has to say, do it again, sir, and put some stank on it this time. Sorry. It's awful if you're living through it, right? I don't mean to make light of it, but I couldn't help myself. It's what I do. It's why I'm not paid very well for what I do. Actually, I'm not paid at all. Ooh, maybe I should change my ways. Let's talk about what this is. Ezer kenegdo. Now, if you look this up in Strong's Concordance, you ain't going to find it. And that was, I think, on purpose. Because the Christian church wanted to keep the women where they wanted to keep the women. And eventually, the Judaism did the same thing. Because in the time of the Second Temple period, there were actually just as many, if not more, female rabbim and female nasieh. Those are the leaders of the synagogue, the ones who make the decisions as to how, what, where, and when everything goes on in the synagogue. Let's see. Can't get it out. Here we go. Oh, watch out. Man, I messed this book up pulling it out. So here we have this book that you probably can't see. I'm trying to make it so you can see it. This book, it says Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogues. It was written by Bernadette J. Bruton. This was her doctoral thesis, and she proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was as many, if not more, leaders of the synagogue who were female in the Second Temple period. It's absolute proof. She did a very good job. It's a good read, by the way, too. It's put together really well. Doctoral thesis is thesis. That's the right word, right? That's in plural, right? Those are generally very dry and hard to read, but this one was a good read. You'll like it. You should get a copy of it. She needs the money anyway. Okay. I don't know. I'm just kidding. That was Harvard, I think. I'm pretty sure it was Harvard, so you can go ahead and look up there. But anyway, she talked about all of that, went into the catacombs, took the pictures, and actually show where this is the blessed Nasieh of the synagogue, and it gives her name and all that kind of stuff. So she proved it with physical evidence. It's like I said, it's a very good read. So things, if you don't want women to be in leadership, you make them the doormat. You make them the Ezer. You don't make them the Ezer kenegdo, because the kenegdo, well, that's equal. That's like 1 equals 1. Not 1 equals me and you are my servant. That equal in every way. He's not above her. She's not above him. He's not smarter than her. She's not smarter than him. He's not allowed to do things she cannot do. None of that. Kenegdo does not allow for that. That's why you won't find this word. Just saying. It's in the Bible. Thus, in verse 22, God separated feminine from masculine, so that she will be exactly like him in all things, except gender. If a man has a feminine side, he's married. If he is not married, he does not have a feminine side. I don't care how he acts. I don't care how many purses he wears, how much gender reassignment he goes through. He will never have a feminine side, because God is the creator, and nothing we can do can change what God created. It's all placebo. It's all fantastical, whatever. It's not real. Sorry, Bruce Jenner, you're not a woman. You've never been a woman. You will never be a woman. You're a man wearing a dress. Just saying. You really disappoint me, Bruce. I was a big fan back in the day. Let's move on. Man cannot be like God. We all know that, right? So this Mashal, this parable, differs at this point to the degree that since man cannot be like God, God will eventually be like man, in perhaps more ways than you may even be able to think. Me included. The you is the proverbial you. Just saying. All right, so we jump to chapter 3, verse 1. There's a soothsayer. Now, I know your Bible says snake, but why does it say snake? Because the word means hisser. Well, snakes hiss. Well, so do soothsayers, people. So there's this soothsayer. He was more subtle than any of the other disobedient among the nations of the land. And he struck up a conversation, or she, we don't know, struck up a conversation with the Torah observant. The man and his wife stood there and listened to the words of the soothsayer, not the words of a snake. They weren't talking to an animal. They were talking to a human being, to mankind, but to the disobedient of the men. Anywho, the soothsayer began to question the Torah observant nation concerning their understanding of the Torah. Isn't that what they always do? Oh, come on. However, by verse 3, we see that the Torah observant have already added their own oral law. I think I missed something. The soothsayer begins to question their observance concerning their understanding of the Torah. However, by verse 3, we see that the Torah observant have already added their own oral laws. You realize that's in the very first book? In the very first story. They've already added their own oral law to the Torah in that God said not to eat. So the Torah observant added, do not touch. Because their thinking was that if they don't touch, they couldn't possibly eat. The soothsayer then said, you cannot possibly believe in all that stuff, can you? Would God really drive you from his presence just because you didn't follow his law to the nth degree? Come on, man. Is that not legalism and bondage? That's legalism and bondage, man. Surely God will understand you not paying your tithe this month. He knows how tight this economy is. He knows you needed that new dress and those pantyhose, and he knew you needed that new wallet. Come on, man. He knows. Surely God will understand that it makes you uncomfortable if you have to wear fringe in public and wear a beard that's unkept. Come on. This stuff is antiquated. People, we're a new, younger generation. God's word is a living, breathing, ever-changing thing with our world, right? You know, like the Constitution, it changes with the generation. Come on. Don't be so old-fashioned. Get with the new millennia, people. So the Torah observant gave into their very excited flesh and mingled the holy with the unholy, and immediately became utterly aware that the only protection they had from Torah rebellion was Torah observance. Once the Torah was broken, man became a slave to Torah rebellion. This is the reality to which the Torah observants suddenly became aware in the day they were separated from the presence of God. In the day they died. Death is, of course, as I said earlier, not the ceasing of breathing in God's world. We continue on eternally after we stop breathing, don't we? Death in God's world is separation from God's presence. Let's see, I think we were in chapter 3, so now we're moving to verse 14. There God curses the non-Torah observant nations of the world to wallow in the filth of their non-Torah rebellion. How do they say that in Hebrew? Well, with English words, it's to crawl on their bellies. It's an idiom. To crawl on your belly was not because you're a snake. You're crawling. The snake's already crawling on his belly. How's it a punishment to make him crawl on his belly? Stop and think about how dumb that is. It's an idiom. He's talking to the people who are not Torah observant. They're going to wallow in the filth of their own Torah rebellion. They're going to crawl on their bellies. And they'll never be satisfied. They'll eat dirt. They'll eat dirt. That's an idiom. To eat dirt is to not be satisfied. In verse 15, God reveals that this act, the mixing of the clean with the unclean, the pure with the impure, has now placed hatred between the children of Torah observance and the rest of mankind. This is why the world has always had an unreasonable hatred of the Jewish people. Are you getting it? The people who complain about everything that we do, about everything we don't do. You what? You don't eat pork? What's wrong with you, man? It's a new white meat. What? You don't go to church? The Sabbath day's on Sunday. Everyone knows that, man. It's right here. That's the hatred of the unclean toward the clean. It's the curse. Verse 16, God cursed the female gender of mankind. In 17, God cursed the male gender of mankind. In 22, God announced that mankind was now comfortable mixing the clean with the unclean. And since there was no sacrifice for Torah rebellion, mankind must, at least at that point in time, be driven from the garden, be driven from paradise, from, what was the word I said? Pleasure. So that they will not mix the clean with the unclean in that place and die in their separation from his presence, because it would have been permanent there. And before you say, Rob, that's stupid. Well, because 15 says, for where no law is, where there is no law, there is no transgression. The garden of pleasure, the place where you're in God's presence, that's the place where there is a law. Anywhere else is not the Garden of Eden. Anywhere else is not the presence of God. Do you see what's... Anyway. The time had finally come once again. We're jumping to the 2nd century now. And before the Jews start jumping down my throat here, listen. Listen to me carefully. If Yeshua was not the Mashiach, half of the Jewish Bible is false. Half of it. Half of the Jewish Bible is filled with false, lying, evil men, because they prophesied that the Messiah would come in the 1st century. They did. Read Daniel. If you don't get it there, go to Yirmiyahu, because he figured out what Daniel was saying. It was a little hard for the Jews at the time because Daniel wrote it in a different language. But Yirmiyahu figured it out, and it's in agreement. You read the anything from that time period, everybody knew, and everybody was waiting on Yeshua to be the Mashiach. That's why they recognize. It's why all of Judea, except for I'm talking tiny, minuscule amount of Jews, they all accepted that he was Mashiach. That Yeshua is Mashiach. Let's put it that way. And if he's not, then half of our Bible is false. Half of it. That's the reality we have to face. But in that time, it had finally come. That same soothsayer struck up a conversation with one fully Torah observant man to see if he could get him to mix the clean with the unclean. Once the soothsayer knew there was no way to outwit this man, he decided to kill him. After all, if the soothsayer could convert the entire world to Torah rebellion, which he did, and he did it easily, there might even be a chance that this Torah observant man could win them all back. Man, he don't want to do that. He's put a lot of hard effort into this. It took the soothsayer quite some time to pull it off, because this Torah observant man added nothing to the Torah, and he took nothing away from it. This Torah observant man truly understood the Torah and the power within it to convert the soul of mankind. On the night that Yeshua was betrayed, he did something that did not take place in the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Pleasure. Let me say that again because I messed it up so bad. On the night that Yeshua was betrayed, he did something that he did not do. I can't read it. I don't know why I can't read it. On the night that Yeshua was betrayed, he did something that did not take place in the Garden of Eden. That's what I'm trying to say. He handed his bride to be a cup to drink, and then taught her that she only needed to do what he did to be protected from her enemies. He made sure that she, his bride, had a yearly reminder of what he, the Mashiach was about to do for her, so that she would always know what to do when she fell, because he knew she would fall. This ceremony was followed by God. Listen to me. This ceremony was followed by God once again leading the Torah observant back to a garden. Once again, God's soul was going to be sorrowful to the point of death. Once again, God asked the Torah observant to stay with him, to keep watch with him, and once again, he would watch her close her eyes. Once again, God's body would tremble in anguish. Once again, God was going to be in the presence of dogs and pigs, who would trample the holy under their feet and deliver him to death. Do you see it yet? Yeshua came for his bride, and she handed him the fruit of death. The moment had once again come that God's bride was listening to a soothsayer, and just like Adam, his bride turned and handed her husband his death sentence, and he drank that cup willingly and died to save her from Torah rebellion. The Torah rebellion of the world is not comprised of all the bad things that we do. Forgiveness of Torah rebellion is not a clean slate which gives us all a pure conscience. The reconciliation of Yisrael is not Jews converting to Christianity, or Yeshua starting a new religious organization on the day of Shavuot. The reconciliation of Yisrael, the taking away of the sin of the world, the salvation of God, the forgiveness of sin, is the reconciliation of God's covenant with mankind. That is to say, the reconciliation of Yisrael is the day when God provided a sacrifice powerful enough to forgive mankind from mixing the holy with the unholy, the clean with the unclean, the pure with the impure. After the Garden of Eden, God reconciled himself to mankind at Mount Sinai when he gave the children of Israel the written Torah. Any human anywhere on earth could be reconciled to God simply by living according to that covenant, to the Torah. As we all know, it was a very short matter of time before the Torah observant were once again driven from the presence of God and were once again in need of a sacrifice for their Torah rebellion. Yeshua's death was the payment in full for our tendency to mix the clean with the unclean. However, no one, Jew or non-Jew, is covered by the blood of that sacrifice unless they live according to the conditions of that sacrifice, according to the Torah. The Torah did not pass away with the death of Yeshua. It was established for all eternity. So I ask you, did you accept God's law over your life last year? Did you say you accepted it just before you drank that cup? Were you successful, or did you fail miserably? When you failed, did you give up, or did you get right back on the path? Those who give up realize one day that they have been separated from God's presence. Those who get right back on the path eventually realize that the blood of Yeshua's sacrifice is why they have not been separated from God's presence. If you did not accept God's Torah over your life last year, will this be the year? Will this be the year or moment that you realize that the reestablishment of God's covenant does not happen by God throwing out the old and starting something new? Get on the path, or get back on the path, and eventually you'll perceive the face and the presence of Yahweh God. Shalom, b'shalom, Yah.